Welcome to the Logosphere. I'm here as always with JD Ruf.
Hello.
And today we have a very special guest, Shirin Ruf, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist who specializes in the treatment of addiction disorders. And rather than do my best to try to expand on that, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are?
Yeah, I mean, my background is in depth psychology, which is primarily Jungian. I went to Pacifica, which is a Jungian school. And most of my work is around addiction treatment, trauma, and I somehow incorporate the analytical perspective into that. And I've recently gotten into EMDR, which is the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And what that is it targets trauma and it reprocesses the memory. And it's fascinating. It's a new thing for me that I'm really finding more about. But yeah, so essentially just trauma and addiction.
And you work mostly with?
Treatment centers on mental health and substance use.
And clients, do you work in group therapy settings, individual?
Both. I do a lot of individual and groups throughout the week. Probably about 15, 20 hours of individual and maybe 5, 7 groups.
How long have you been doing it?
Long time. 15 years. Not as a therapist. I started as a case manager and then a counselor, and I was in admission. So just different roles, but within the treatment center.
Did you have different degrees before you?
Yeah, I had my KDAC, which was just limited to counseling, and then I've had a lot of different trainings and different things, mostly addiction related. But I mean, it's more of the same. You know, obviously, therapy is much more in depth, but ultimately working with addicts and mental health patients or clients since then.
And was this something you were doing before you did any of these things professionally? Is it a profession you chose because it was something you found yourself doing anyway?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, I feel like I didn't choose it as much as it chose me, you know? I definitely had a different idea as far as what I wanted to do, something that didn't entail so much of my own personal growth or involvement for a job, you know? I wanted a job that paid me what I wanted and I go home and not think about it. But I kept coming back to this. Somehow, even since I was like a teenager, I found myself being the counselor and the mediator. And then it ultimately...
As a teenager in your family?
No. I don't have a lot of contact with my family. So I went to a boarding school. So my dorm parents and my teachers were essentially the family that I had around me. And somehow I was constantly in that role, not because I wanted to, but I've been told that I have that presence that sort of brings out the counselor, what's the word? The person that people want to confide in and trust. Confidant, that's the word. Mm-hmm. So I took some classes just to check it out, and I kept going, and ultimately to graduate school, and now, you know, I mean, you just keep going with this stuff.
But I'm curious. So you have a personal connection, though, to...
the whole thing is personal.
Yeah, for addiction, right? That's what you're trying to get at, right?
My next question would be, how did you decide to start working with addicts?
It takes one to know one. So there's that, and my crazy matches their crazy, and our crazy just happens to work really well. So the first contact was with obviously 12-step programs, you know, AA, NA, where I started to work with sponsors and then ultimately started sponsoring other people. And the process of step work got me into therapy, and the therapist that helped me, really, I think the most fascinating part is having done some of my own work with therapists and getting to know how I would go from absolute hopeless and just defeated to like, oh, I get that, and then form these different ideas, which will then lead me to more defeat and hopeless, and then come out with that. So I think my interest really started with having witnessed my own work. I thought, how do you do what you do? I want to know more about that. And 12 steps kind of allowed me to do that. And with the right training, I expanded to therapy. But as I do my own work, I'm able to do the work with others. In fact, Carl Jung's one of the many wonderful sayings he has is you can only take them as far as you're willing to go yourself, not further, right? So as I expand within, naturally and organically, I have this capacity to take them in places they would normally not go because they know that you don't know, right? There's this nonverbal language that happens.
There's another saying that comes to mind: you cannot transmit something you haven't got.
That's right. See to it that your relationship with them is right. Great events will come to pass.
So you initially found recovery in a spiritual domain, and then you found yourself eventually in a therapeutic domain.
Right.
Yourself.
That's how it's, yeah. That's
before
all.
you eventually became the clinician.
Right.
Yeah. And so I guess I was, in thinking about talking to you, that, within the area of treatment for addiction and alcoholism, there is, the modern medicine therapeutic approach, and then there is, still the tried and true spiritual remedy. And, how do those two aspects get reconciled? Do they go hand in hand? Is one preferable to the other? Does one soften someone so that they can ultimately be received in the other? Are they at odds with each other? Does it depend?
They both have their place. I think, they're both effective, but we just don't know when to stop with one and start with the other, right? We have these two different groups of people that take one all the way and then the others go all the way, like the Western medicine and sort of that scientific view kind of dismisses the spiritual aspect, and then vice versa. So, but when they're both used for their intended purposes, work really well.
It's funny because something like that came up, and I think it happened to you doing your MDMR class, right? You had a trainer that was like, basically said that when you have an addiction problem, it's some trauma that wasn't, and then once you kind of go through this therapy. Yeah. Can you expand on that a little bit, maybe?
That came up where a part of the training was on addiction. And, in the workbook and the manual, basically it said that addiction is a direct result of unprocessed trauma and inadequately stored distress, meaning trauma, and that by doing EMDR, you get to reprocess those memories and really have a different narrative around them, which will then mean you no longer would struggle with addiction, right? Or that's the idea, is that you no longer find it necessary to use, or substance or whatever the addiction is not an issue, because you have now placed the trauma that initially sort of was the trigger for the maladaptivity. And then I chimed in with that, and I said, well, I beg to differ, sir, because I have very much experienced personally a different version of that. No matter how much, reprocessing I've done, maybe not EMDR, but definitely I've always been in some form of therapy. Relapse, meaning having a certain amount of abstinence followed by, I'm just going to drink wine, or I'm fine now because I've done all this healing, so naturally I'm not going to abuse it. I almost always found that I would fall back into excessive. Even if I limited to beer or wine or whatever it was not going to be the sort of the normal couple drinks here and there. I was going to take it to the next level no matter what it was going to be. So I don't see that being I would hope that works, and it might. Not addicts and alcoholics are the same. It all depends on your chemistry and your background, your trauma. So many different components go into that. But for me, that probably wouldn't be true.
Do you think trauma is inseparable from addiction issues? I mean, you could be traumatized and not necessarily have addiction problems, but could you have addiction problems and not have trauma? Yeah,
I mean, I think, not all people that have trauma are addicts, but almost all addicts have trauma.
There's another saying I've heard, which is, what is it? Not all neurotics are alcoholics, but all alcoholics are neurotics.
Yes.
There's sort of like a,
What's a neurotic for anybody listening? Like, how would you describe a neurotic?
You might be able to define this better than you
Oh
would.
God, neuroses is something, of course, Freud and Jung were all over that. There is an aspect of it that's natural and it's not bad, but it's where it exceeds its intended purposes.
Where does it not exceed its intended purpose? Where is neuroticism healthy? Is it just to have a healthy degree of anxiety so that you're ready, so that you're aware? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, anxiety is like anger, anxiety, or sadness. None of these are bad. They're very much necessary. You want me to be anxious when I'm crossing the street, I want to be terrified when I'm looking down from a tall building. In that same way, or like ego. There is neurosis is one of those things that I think when it's understood and when there's enough self-awareness around it, then it's not going to harm me or it's not going to take over. If I'm aware of the neuroses, then who's having the neuroses versus the person that's observing it?
To me, it makes me think about, fight or flight, or sometimes they say freeze.
Or lizard brain.
Yeah. Just these, obviously, sometimes I need to fight, and sometimes I need to flee. But sometimes this can take on a life of its own.
And sometimes, like you said, with the trauma, the fight, freeze, flight responses get warped, So then
we start to become afraid. We want to flee when there is no danger. We perceive one where there isn't one because we've been so warped and damaged at a point in the past that we're hypervigilant. We're seeing threats where there aren't any. And so we're no longer able to really function because we're always in this state of anxiety and worry, and probably the drinking and the drugging or whatever are done to soothe that constant state of agitation and fear and discomfort that we're in. Yeah. So the idea is if we get out our forensic, toolkit and we go back in the past and we try to put our finger on when the initial trauma happened, and if we can, work through it and reframe it and understand it and digest it and process it and, uncover it and discover it and discard it, then we might be able to live in some sort of peace and contentment in our present life. And then the need to drink and drug alcoholically or addictively should not be there anymore, or should be lessened. It's a basic idea.
That's a basic idea, yes.
It's not too basic,
very
though.
Eloquently put. Yeah, you're right. There's not a lot basic about that.
Yeah.
So are we saying now, between the three of us, right, that all drug addicts and alcoholics, right, people that really struggle with addiction, have trauma that caused that snowballed into the addiction?
I mean, I don't know if we're saying that necessarily. I don't know if any of us are going to make that claim, but I think we're trying to tease it apart.
Yeah,
because obviously there are some people that have unimaginably horrific things happen to them, and they only become resilient and more productive as a result of it. And then other people have a much different experience. And probably no one, even if you had parents who were, one lifetime away from being sages, are still immune from trauma, because life is just like that, right?
Right. Coming out of the canal is traumatic, right?
Yeah.
Couldn't that be all humans? We share that.
Yeah.
I don't think a baby comes out going, yeah, that was great. That was not traumatic.
We all get very sick at a young age, and we see the death of our family members, and we watch the news and what's happening in Ukraine, and, you know, we get a bad grade on our test. And I mean, life is just, you know, regardless of your situation, it's just it's a series of
so maybe
stressful and difficult events.
So maybe then, I mean, I'm just talking about this philosophically, right? Like trauma, or it's the coping mechanism to trauma. Maybe that's the thread that ties all alcoholics together.
Yeah, so there's that kind of that predisposition idea. Some people are more predisposed to certain behaviors when they feel stressed, right? They respond to stressors differently. There's probably studies that I couldn't even close to citing about rats and things like that, and how, you know, there's different conditions in which, you know, not just humans, but, you know, other creatures will, you know, want to seek comfort through, you know, chemical means and things like that. And
so dispositions would be like...
Well, I was thinking trauma is one of those things, one of those words that's so it's thrown around so often. Everybody's traumatized to some extent.
Yeah. And
even like you said, coming out of, you know, the birth process.
Right. That's why I said it. Yeah.
Is it though, you know?
Or is it just nature?
I think we've really kind of gone overboard with the word trauma and the ways that we have with I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I have anxiety, I have bipolar. Like we've just we've at least in my experience it's become such a norm now to where everybody's traumatized. Trauma, you know, it's not a handful or at least a specific group of people that have experienced trauma. Now it's almost odd if you haven't had trauma.
Because I guess we all relate to, I think, all of these different disorders to a degree. And it's tough because these disorders are just things that we've done our best to conceptualize. But, you know, ADHD is another one. You know, we all have a hard time sitting down and reading a book because our minds tend to wander regardless of who you are. But then we have a criteria for which we decide what is clinically, you know, qualifies as attention deficit disorder.
And then what's normal.
Or OCD, right? I come in here every week and try to force JD to clean up the wires because but I could say I have OCD, but I think that you probably understand that actual OCD is a much different thing. You know, but where that line is, you sit down with a clinician and they ask you some questions and you open up the DSM, and if you hit 4 out of 7, you know, boxes, then all of a sudden you have OCD or ADHD or major depressive disorder, any of these things, you know, but, you know, we're doing our best, right?
And you're going and basically what's happening with the diagnoses is really, it's not realistic and it's not sustainable. So you go to the doctor, you go to the psych, and they give you a diagnosis like bipolar or OCD, and now you have this whole, you know, now it's like it solidifies, like there's something wrong with me, and here's the symptoms, and here's the criteria. So instead of what the fuck is wrong with you for going through the wires and being so, however anxious or however that's affecting your life, now it's like, well, I have OCD, you know. I have this, and we almost make peace with that's who I am. And there's this notion that once you get diagnosed with just about any of the DSM diagnoses, that's it, like that for life. You know, just like a name that you're given, like you have a borderline diagnosis or bipolar or OCD, and I don't really find that to be true. I did for a long time, but recently, since I've gone into the Emdr and into the Richard Short's work, which is Internal Family Systems, that is like my new jam now. I'm getting all
elaborate on that.
Into his stuff. I'm just very obsessive like that. Like I just get into one thing and it's over. I do that with like food. Remember pho? Like I just have pho every day, all day, and then I don't fucking want to ever see it again. It's but with IFS, Internal Family Systems, the idea is that there is parts. So, for instance, when I take the very anxious, very moody version to a psychologist, and meet all the criterias and get diagnosed with, for instance, bipolar. It's true that I have bipolar because I'm very much exhibiting all of the symptoms, but that's one part, the part that has bipolar. And it shows up and it affects aspects of my life. But then there's the other part that goes to work and produces a lot of results and is like a really good wife or a really good girlfriend or a great neighbor, right? What about that part then, right? But bipolar really, it's like this blanket thing. So the Internal Family Systems Modal is that what's that saying? The sum of the whole is greater. What is that?
Parts.
The parts, right? It's the systems theory, basically.
Some of the parts
meaning,
is greater than the whole.
That's right.
Yeah.
So he's using the systems theory, meaning that we're picking one part and we're making it mean like that's who you
Internal
are.
family systems. So that's not dealing with your actual family. This is
No. These are the internal family.
So it's like your subpersonalities.
That's right.
Wow.
So within those units of personalities, there's subtypes, and it just goes on and on. So we used to call this multiple personality disorder, but then the DSM changed it to dissociative identity disorder because of the very fact that everybody has multiple aspects of personality. The most functioning, healthy person would tell you that they have this voice that goes, don't do that because it's probably not the right thing to do. And then there's the other voice that goes, yeah, but I really want to. That's the problem is not that there's several aspects of personality. The problem is that they are fragmented with...
Yeah. It's one of the horrible things
dissociative.
about being human, right? One part of us wants something, the other part says no. We're sort of at odds with ourselves.
Well, we can be, but we can value both because they both have a really good point. So there's a part of me that really wants to have another piece of cake versus the other part goes, but like you remember how like you feel shitty afterward and you decide not to do that? Like, let's think about that, right? They both have a very valid point. What happens with the DID patients is that they have these fragmented parts of personality and none of them are aware of each other, right? For the functional psyche, there's the good me and then there's like that little bit of a bad self or evil or sort of the sinful one. With the dissociative person, you've got, a 16-year-old that's promiscuous and acts out. You have a 25-year-old that's a teacher and lives in London. You've got, and none of them are aware of each other.
You really want to have more of an inner dialogue than an inner monologue, right? The
Yes.
idea of to be bouncing these things off of different dimensions within yourself is a good thing.
But they're all under the umbrella of one self with the capital S. So you have the me self, as in the version that I am, my age, my, capabilities as an adult, my accomplishments. And then you have the child part, the one that acts out, the one that wants to run, or the one that doesn't want to get out of bed, right? None of them are me, but all of them are me. So a lot of us want to get rid of certain parts. I want to get rid of this piece and that piece, and I want more of this piece. How do I do that?
Yeah.
But based on the Internal Family Systems Model, the goal is not to get rid of any part. The goal is to get to know them and approach them with more of a curiosity rather than I would like, for instance, the part that binges or purges, or the part that self-harms or cuts. Well, naturally, I want to not do those things, so how do I get rid of that part? And he found with a couple decades of research that the more that he tried to get rid of the part that was deemed as, not functional, the worse the acting out got.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of that saying, all my character defects that I've gotten rid of have claw marks on them. Because when you're trying to overcome some defect that you have, I like to eat carbs too much, right? You'll starve yourself from them, right? From that little activity. Yeah. And then you'll just binge, you'll cave and you'll go, okay, I'll just eat a whole cake, not just one piece.
Yeah, but the notion really is that they serve a function. They're not as defective as I think they are, right? Because when you think about the part that self-harms because they're anxious, so they cut, or the part that, as a result of sadness, depression, binges and then purges, or whatever it may be, we view that as very bad, and I want to get rid of it, and getting better would mean that no longer exists. But that's not so, because what's the function that they serve? Every fragmented personality type was designed subconsciously by the nervous system to help me survive. So for instance, if I'm watching horrific, mom and dad fighting, and there's just intense aggression, physical abuse, and I'm, let's say, 7 years old, there's no way that at 7 I have the capacity to understand that that's not me. They have marital issues. It says nothing about who I am or what I am. You're gonna immediately shut down and go hide, basically. So then there's the part of you at 37 when you're having an argument with your wife or husband that they start yelling. It gets heated, and I just get in my car and I'm out. Mm-hmm. Because the 7-year-old comes out and goes, I don't do conflict. This is too much. Right?
Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with inner child work? Is that
that's
another approach? Or
that's another term. Yeah, inner child is another word for part or mm-hmm. unit. Mm-hmm. These are just different terms. Whatever that most resonates with you. I wasn't really into the inner child for some reason, and I worked with a mentor for a long time, and I just, that word, even though it was the same work, it just, something about inner child didn't sit well with me. But the parts, it's like, oh, I get that. There's the part that like wants to get back at that person. Oh, there's the part that's like, yeah, that's not who we are anymore. And then you sit back and just watch the circus go by, He actually, something that's so fascinating to me is, he talks about it like, he said, I treat my patients in the same way that I do with couples therapy. I hear your side, hear their side, and I try and mediate and come to a conclusion. Yeah. Essentially, you do that with yourself. The part that goes, I don't want to be in this relationship, I'm over it, I just want to go do whatever I want. And the part that goes, but we love this person, and it's a good thing, and this is what we have always wanted, is it not? And try to have them dialogue with each other as the self being the therapist, mm-hmm. the capable self. Like, you know what? The part that wants to just run and fuck all this, you go sit in the waiting room, like in a room away, because this self is gonna have a conversation with the part that is genuine and wants something more. Mm. And then you go in the waiting room now, and the other part comes in, and then you bring them together. Literally how you would do couples therapy, or any form of therapy that involves more than one person.
Yeah, there's another concept which it brings to mind is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, Hegel.
Yeah.
Or was that Hegel?
Or is it Heidegger?
No, it's not Heidegger.
Okay.
Well,
we'll have to fact check this
one.
We'll
have to fact check that one. I think it's...
I always get them confused, even though they're very different.
Yeah, mm-hmm. But that's a great term, though.
Yeah.
I think it's Hegel, though.
Mm-hmm.
We'll stop there. We're trying to get to the root of who came up with that idea. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was Heidegger. You might be right.
I think I am, as usual.
I'll look it up, I guess. As usual.
But ultimately, my fascination with all of this is directly linked to my own work, because I do come from, just an absurd amount of trauma and having been raised in a completely different country and brought here, and then boarding school, and then addiction later on in adult life. I mean, there's a lot there to where just now I'm starting to feel like there's nothing wrong with me. This narrative around you're damaged, like there's something fundamentally wrong with you. I mean, it's not bad. Just gotta accept that and live with it and make the best out of it. Yeah. That's being lifted now, and I'm going, even the parts that I hate, even the parts that I wish I would get rid of, even the ones that I lock in the basement and throw away the keys, I am now going, come on up, have a cup of tea with me. Like, where is this need to want to hurt people? Mm-hmm. How did that help you survive? What are you afraid of? If you were to give up your job as the cutter, as the binger, what are you afraid would happen if you no longer held that position? Right? Having this dialogue on and on with the parts has been like, oh my God, I'm not insane. And yes, I do sound insane because of all of this, but it has given me so much hope in knowing that they all serve the function. They help me survive. You know, the part that's like, do not let them get close. Arm's length. What the fuck is wrong with you? Don't let anybody get too close. That part may not be so effective now at 35, living in Thousand Oaks, married. But when I was 16, that probably saved my life.
Yeah. I've come across this idea working in treatment settings myself when it comes to cutting or eating disorders or different types of behaviors, that they're maybe arguably maladaptive, but you don't just rip them away from someone, you know. And same with addictive, you know, drug and alcohol problems. A lot of people who have those issues will say it probably saved my life at some point, right?
Yes.
I don't know if I would have made it this far if it wasn't for that at that time.
Absolutely. You would have probably, you know, we hear this all the time. I would have probably hurt myself, killed myself, taken myself out, something. Like, it absolutely helps me tolerate life as I knew it then. Mm-hmm. You know, it made me feel like, you know what, maybe I can do this thing called life.
Yeah. With the other stuff, I'm afraid of derailing the conversation, but it keeps coming to mind, so I'm going to make an effort. I think about, so is it internal family systems?
Internal family systems.
Yeah. I mean, so obviously there's a parallel with, you know, looking at the way we work within ourselves as an analogy to the way that a family system might work, or you could probably say as a society might work. And it's tough when you are in a family with, or in a society with, or in a community with people who are behaving in a way that is reprehensible, that you do not like, that is hurting you, right? What do you do about it? You know, so there's the, you know, there is the model of let's throw them in jail, right? Let's stop the behavior. But the problem with that is that it never really addresses the issue. You know, I think about, you know, culture wars issues too, with, say, like racism, without jumping too far down that rabbit hole. If people are speaking or thinking in a way that someone deems to be inappropriate, you know, one approach is to shut them up, right? To call them names, to throw them off a platform, to put them in a corner somewhere right. Because what they're doing is wrong. But what usually happens is if your intention is to create a more fair, equitable society, by doing that, the effect oftentimes seems to be the opposite, right? By trying to shut something up, it only seems to breathe energy into that thing which you would want to, you know, want to try to remedy.
That's right.
And so within ourselves, it's maybe similarly, right? If there's this impulse I have that I don't approve of, that I can see at some level is not working for me, and I just try to continuously hold the springs down on it and to disregard it and to disavow it, the problem is that it's like with, you know, it's like with springs. The farther you hold them down, eventually, when they pop back up, they pop back up with just that much force, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and so what do? But then on the opposite side of the spectrum, if you just, you know, with, you know, I think therapy and the modern era gets some criticism nowadays because everyone is just like, let's listen to you and what happened to you and poor you and you're okay, and there's no room to just say, no, that's wrong and you can't do it anymore. And I'm sure you as a parent probably has some instances where you know, sometimes you just need to say, stop doing that. Go in your room and stay there, right? We're not going to listen to you. We're not going to love you into good behavior because it certainly doesn't work. You know, every once in a while, you just need to shut up, be quiet, go in your room, and come out when we tell you.
That's right.
Yeah.
We were there about 9 hours ago. We were right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that to some degree, I mean, in society at large, if we just opened up all the prisons and defunded all the police, we would probably have, you know, we would descend into chaos in, you know, 3 days, right? So maybe there's a both strategy. It's like in the near term, since we don't have the, you know, the healing capacity of, you know, of deities, we have to do what we need to in order to, you know, get to the next day. But ultimately the higher goal would be to, you know, to try to it's like with medical remedies too, right? You want to try to cure the underlying disease. You don't want to just treat the symptom, because you could put a Band-Aid on something as long as you want, but if you're not addressing why the wound exists,
right.
it's it's really not it's not the best. It's not the optimal approach.
Damn, man, you just went on a... What have you been reading lately? That was a good connection, actually. Yeah. That was like... I was feeling a little malice in that.
Yeah.
And, just to break it up a little bit, I was right. It was Hegel.
Oh, my God. He's been waiting for that this whole time.
Just so you know.
Okay.
So, yeah, Hegel was before Heidegger, too. Yeah. And he was the one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm reading Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life right now to prepare for going to see him in April. But prior to that, I read Ryan Holiday's Trust Me, I'm Lying. And and just before that, I read Abigail Schreier's... I can't remember the name of her book right now. But anyway, I've been on a reading tear, but I don't think any of that has to do with... None of that really connects to...
Well, no, but what you touched on there was specifically it's like taking the mind and the pieces of the mind, kind of like the IF, the family systems, model, and then applying that to the greater culture, right? Like expanding it out and saying like, yeah, we the cancel culture thing is obviously it just creates like what a lot of people have witnessed, and this is kind of getting into politics, but when you marginalized an opinion and you just go, no, you can't speak at this platform. You see this with a lot of the intellectual dark web, like Joe Rogan and Shapiro and stuff. When you do that, you just create a bigger monster, basically. And I totally agree with that. Like you can't. And one thing that popped in my head was the Freudian notion of sexual repression, right? Like, if you're repressing these urges over and over and over again, it's that spring thing. It'll come out and it'll rear its ugly head. That's why I brought up the claw mark thing. When you're doing work on it.
Even there's like asceticism and spiritual paths. There's at some point the spiritual seeker tries to just cut everything off, right? I don't know if you've heard the term sexually anorexic. Someone might have sex and love issues.
We both know somebody who uses that term often, actually.
Yeah. And so it's like what might appear to be being chaste or to be celibate is actually pathological,
Well, it's funny because Nietzsche had a critique of Buddhism because that's the whole idea is like don't have desire, right?
Yeah.
Just completely.
But I think that I don't know. I'm definitely not an expert on Buddhism, but I think there's that middle path idea, right? Like the Buddha had that part of his story where it was,
Yeah, he went completely.
I don't need any,
Nothing. Like 1 grain of rice for weeks. No, I understand, but
that becomes its own, right? If you're trying to, it's that thing that aversions are attachments, right?
Right.
If I'm trying to avert something, I am attached to the aversion of it, right? There's a level of
you're creating another path.
Detachment is not willfully, staving off.
Yeah, because his critique was he came up with the term Buddhist nihilism, right? He'd say like you get so detached from reality that you're just it's like, what are you doing? You know what I mean? You're totally nihilist. You could be even considered like you're in a neurosis because you don't care about anything. You're just like sexually anorexic or whatever. There's different symptoms of it, but yeah, that's an interesting thought. But yeah, let's go. I'm kind of blank tonight, I guess, but what you guys are talking about is fascinating. I'm just trying to keep up.
I guess with the trauma stuff, to circle back to that, and this relates to other like spiritual approaches to recovery from alcoholism and addiction, there seems to be a good place for, we have to go back, right? We have to go back into the past. We have to investigate. In this, similar to the sexually anorexic, I've confronted this a lot when it comes to people who are trying to recover from addiction, is like, that happened in the past, I'm over it, right? And
There was so much of that.
You recognize
Oh my God.
you're not over it. If you're so, over it, you're usually probably deceiving yourself.
But even if you're not that over it, if you genuinely appear as though, you know what, I've done some work and it doesn't control my life anymore, and I want to be positive, and I don't want to bring up. I have seen so many times where it's very convincing. I'm not convinced, but I could see the rest of the world being very much convinced in that it is over, and it's not, because we want to spray perfume all over it and put on this affirmation, self-help. I am beautiful. I am lovable. I am rich. It's like, yeah, what? None of that works unless I believe it to be true.
Yeah, it becomes self-deception, right?
And choice is a function of awareness. And awareness comes with work. So really, it.
But at some point, I think, we can get so stuck and just constantly,
Oh, that's the point.
In
you were
therapy
talking,
and going back
Yes.
and trying to find the exact origin of the wound and processing it over and over again, right? And at some point, it's like there's the other approach, right? And probably neither of these is right or wrong, and they have to kind of hold hands with each other. But it's like, how do we move forward?
That's what was brought up before you did your fact check. James Hillman is a Jungian analyst that his book, We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy. And we've gotten nowhere.
Yeah.
And he talks a lot about the fact that we're talking and talking and talking week after week, years after years, about what happened to me, what it was like. And there's some, there's momentary awareness or clarity, but ultimately I'm in the story. I continue to stay in that story of what happened because, I want to process. Processing does not mean that I have to stay in the story and the details of what happened. I'm not doing a lot of talk therapy myself. Back in the day, I was all about it, and now I just feel like I don't need to hear the story. I don't need to talk about the story. It's not as relevant as I think. It's not so much what happened that hurts me, it's my beliefs about what happened. So it doesn't really matter who did what and how it occurred. More so, what did I make that mean about who I am or who I'm not, right? Because the belief, it's what's hurting me today. That person or the trauma or the traumatic event is long gone, right? Because I'm safe now and nothing is threatening. But my thoughts about being worthless, being inadequate, not being enough as a result of the trauma, like that's what needs to be addressed rather than
how that gets changed. We understand those beliefs can be really deeply rooted. And so I think that, right, we go back in the past in hopes that if we uncover the right stone, then suddenly our beliefs might change outfits and and look better for the party or whatever the case may be. And I think a lot of the other approaches you talked about, which is like positive affirmations and law of attraction, and I'm trying to augment my beliefs by rather than repeating, throughout my day, I'm repeating this story about myself as not being good enough and doomed to failure, and I'm going to say the wrong thing, and once I do, I'm going to dwell on it all night, and it's going to keep me up because this is the person that I am. You try to interrupt that, try to change the TV station, and you just go to one that, is, I'm great, I'm fantastic, the people in my life love me because I show them love, or whatever the story may be. And maybe the station you change it to is highly produced, it's a reality show, but it's like, one that is obviously highly scripted and not very authentic, but at least it's a better, it's more enjoyable to watch than, the, snuff film that I'm used to watching all day long. And so I'm going to try that station out.
Snuff film.
Let's get weird. Yeah.
Do you know what snuff is?
Do I know what snuff is?
Isn't that where you kill somebody?
Yeah. I was trying to think of a...
I'm sorry, that just you slipped that in there. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of that movie 8mm. You see that one with...
Nick Cage?
Yeah. Oh my God.
Is it Nick Cage?
It is Nicolas Cage. And he is a detective or something, and he's trying to find who are these? And I think it turns out that it's Russians, actually, which is ironic right now. But they make these snuff films.
Yeah.
Ah, what a horrible. I mean, geez. That's like dirt. It's like disgusting.
I'm so tempted to go off on a Nick Cage tangent right now, but it would really. I was telling JD that I'm on a big Kanye West trip right now, and I think I am interested in him in the same way that I'm interested in Nick Cage. You know, when it comes to artistic, cultural figures, when they're just weird. You know, there's something about that. You know, that I.
Well, it's probably because you're weird and you're weird. Yeah. You're crazy, like what she says at the beginning of the podcast. Yeah. Crazy matches, you know. And the other topic that I wanted to, do you think you're more effective as a therapist? This is going to go back to Shirin, because you are recovered from drugs and alcohol. Do you think that plays a big role in like your work? Because as a recovering addict, and maybe we can wrap it up after this.
We have a little bit of time.
We have a little bit of time, but I just find this interesting because I'm not going to go too long on this rabbit hole. But when I got off of drugs and alcohol, I only felt comfort with other drug addicts and alcoholics. Right, when it was a therapist sitting in a chair with their degrees on the wall. I was like, fuck you, basically.
But what if you get both? You get the degrees and the like-minded experience.
Then it's like, and then the other thing that you brought up at the beginning of this is it kind of sounds woo, but the aura that people put off, that energy you put off when you come into a room, like people want to listen to you, they take you seriously. It's something that you said that you had when you were 18. You know, when you were a kid, you had a little bit of that. You know. And that's interesting because there's always people that we like kind of look towards, you know, and you've always been like that for me, you know, and all the people that I've ever seen around you over the years that I've known you, and I'm just wondering I
think it's definitely true for, I mean,
do some people have it, or do you know? It's like, are you born with it? Like, what is it? Experience?
Yeah,
is it trauma? Is it?
I think it's a combination of all. There is a sense of giftedness.
Right.
And I don't know if you remember this. You probably don't. When we first met, I remember distinctly having a conversation with you on the phone where I said something. I was in that Calabasas apartment where I said something along the lines of, this is going to sound weird, and it's not coming from ego, and it's not coming from any kind of a place where pride or any of that, but I have this ability to be a medium between some form of a higher power and people at that time and still, meaning addicts or traumatized, the population that's underprivileged. So I have experienced this, and I do almost on a daily basis, if I allow it, if I'm connected enough, to where I'm sitting there and somebody's talking, and literally, and this happened a couple weeks ago where I had a client that had a beanie on. There's nothing abnormal about that. And we're talking, and I'm doing their assessment, and suddenly I had this thought, as if you had told me, or somebody completely outside of me had said, ask him to take his beanie off. What? What does that have anything to do with anything? And then I go with it because I trust it. I've really developed a strong relationship with it. And I go, can you take your beanie off? And he would not. I said, well, why not? You know, young kid, 20-something. I said, why not? He says, I don't take this thing off ever. Like, my girlfriend hasn't seen me without it. I said, why not? Well, because there's severe baldness or something that, like, so I asked them, and he trusts me enough. There's a strong therapeutic rapport where he said, I mean, I'm not walking out of this office without it, but I'll take it off for a second. And it wasn't the same person. Like, it went from a pretty decent looking kid to like not so much, like within a split second, because there was severe balding, almost like old man type, right? Not like getting there, it's there. Where would I get that from? So
he's got some kind of condition.
Yes.
That he's kind of holding back. He doesn't want it to be out in the sun.
Right, but there is no reasonable, or at least any way that you could explain this. This was session 2. Like, I barely knew him. I had and it was chilly outside. Like, there was no reason for me to have that. But this happens all the time. All the time, where I go, is that your mom? I mean, things that I would have no access to. I know this. It just feels like I'm being informed of information, and almost always it's like so right on point. And people tell me, oh, you're so like, wow, you're so amazing. And to the ones that I'm close with, I say, I genuinely, it's not me as much as the Father doeth the work, right? Whatever that means to you. But if I'm open to it, it transmits through me.
What do you think about mediums and psychics and that whole area?
The woo.
Yeah, I don't know too much about psychics. I don't feel that it's any of our business to be tapping into what it's going to be like, in a way.
I find it fascinating, though, that psychics still play such a big role in just, you could drive down Wilshire Boulevard and, every several blocks you're going to see a little psychic building, right? And you can only imagine how much the rent costs in that location. And there they are, and they're open.
And they make a killing.
And someone's going in there, and
it's putting lots of money on the table, too.
And it's kind of almost universally thought of as, as being superstitious. And if you're into that, then there's something must be wrong with you. But I imagine that, between therapy and mediums and spiritual,
gurus.
Yeah, all of these things are all kind of standing around the same fire a little bit, right?
They really are. There's a little bit of all of that. I think with the thing with psychics is it makes you really wonder, what's our fascination with knowing about the future?
Yeah, I mean, and this brings, I think one of the first reasons that JD thought it would be interesting to have you on was this question he brought up just about therapy. And it's like, well, what's going on there? Why is therapy effective? What is a therapist doing? And all of these different, maybe a therapist, whether they know it or not, they're still sort of acting as a medium. And a medium is in the sense that they're standing between the person and something more transcendent, right? The person who is seeking therapy is doing it because they're hoping to transcend their own limitations.
Facilitating, essentially.
And they can't. And so the therapist or whoever isn't there to heal them themselves, hopefully, but helping them to rise above their own condition.
It's important to really remember that, because we can get caught up with a lot of, my skills and my training, or like me. There's very little me. Essentially what my only function is to serve as a facilitator for growth. So I sit back and I try and facilitate a lot of your own conclusions and try and basically hold the mantle as we walk down this lane. I don't know where we're going. I know you don't know, that's why you're here, but I don't have the answers. But I do know a couple things that might help us along the way.
Have you studied Carl Rogers at all?
Yes, of course, The Way of Being.
He's like, it's so, you should check this out, JD. You can find actual footage of sessions that he's done from in the 60s or 70s.
Powerful.
Some are in group settings and some aren't. And
I've seen a couple.
And his approach, it's like it's kind of become a little bit cliche. The therapist says, "How do you feel?" and they just mirror back. You say something, and then they say it back to you. Right. And there's these different techniques. But it's fascinating to watch him. He listens to these people and asks them a few questions, but he's got this like air about him. It's this positive regard. And the idea is that he's just giving the person the space in order to do whatever they need to do.
Yeah, to heal themselves.
He doesn't have the answers. It's all about the unconditional positive regard.
And it's like 4 or 5 minutes into this session, you have these people that he's never met before, and they're just like they're taking their beanie off, right?
Yeah.
Figuratively, they're just saying, and I think we all want that. We all really want to be in a place where we can be seen by someone else in our most insecure areas, right? But it's such a threat to do that, to show that to people is
to be open.
It's life threatening and probably has long evolutionary roots,
right,
to showing our weaknesses off.
We're terrified of we so badly want to be seen. We're desperate to be seen. I want you to see me, but at the same time, there's that horrifying, that grip, that fear of what if you see and you run for the hills, right? What is it like to ultimately my goal is to really be able to witness the darkness, shadow, and sit with it and not look away.
Yeah.
Like just it's like Jesus talks about, like, sit with me in my darkest hour. You're not gonna fix it.
And some of that probably comes back to our own acceptance of, it's because of course I would think you would run for the hills because I would run for the hills if I had the opportunity.
Because that's how I feel about myself.
Yeah. But if we, stop running from our own hills and we get to a different place about, our position, then maybe it's got to, it can't be one or the other, right? It's both are sort of going on, but it's interesting that we need other people for it. And it happens within, other, areas for alcoholic treatment is this like, it's and it happens in church too. It's like, it's where one or more are together.
Yes.
Well, it happens in school. It happens in stadiums. It happens all over the place. It's the Logosphere. It really is the participating in dialogue, trusted dialogue, like what we're kind of.
Yeah, but what's going on?
Exactly. Yeah. What is going on? I mean, well, one thing that is interesting. There's this philosopher I read, the Headless one, where he talks about how we're oriented towards each other. This just popped in my head, but how our faces are facing each other, our sexual organs are facing each other, like. We're meant to be like right with each other, communicating back and forth. It's not like we have eyeballs that evolved so we can see behind us. Like physically, there's a physical element to it where we need to be kind of like right with each other, like open, face to face. And there's something about that. We don't have eyes in the back, like I said, right? And so that there's this like underlying condition that we're born with, that we need to be open towards each other, and when we're not, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. Like I think of John Paul Sartre, the look is terrifying. You kill me with your look. When you look at me, if I'm not secure in my being, I die. I crack into a million pieces.
I've always been very fascinated by the Scientology, and I'm not an expert on it, but there's like this practice where two people have to look at each other.
Oh, yeah.
And they have to just launch the most like just ruthless insults, that are personal, and they go straight for the jugular, and they just look at each other and they just offend each other, and in a very, honest, direct way, calling the person out for every,
right,
inadequacy. And
I get. Well, Landmark does that kind of thing too.
Landmark does do that.
But it's not the insult. Is it the insult thing?
It's not an insult. It's just a stare.
You just have to stare at somebody and
Very
hold their
close.
gaze.
Yeah.
And like you don't know this person
at all.
I mean, anybody at home try. It's kind of trippy, really. Like you stand in front of somebody, and you usually have like a line, and you have to keep a certain posture, and you just stare, and that's it. And like people cry, they break down, they start laughing, they get all fearful, and I mean, wow!
I did, yeah. As soon as I was faced with
had like a dude in front of you, yeah.
I couldn't breathe, and I started sobbing. Just I don't know if it was a mixture of all things, but going back to the other, why do I need the other? Because the other is not the other; it's me, right?
What do you mean?
It's only in my relationship with other people that I get to experience myself. What I love, what I dislike, what I can't stand, what irritates me, what aggravates me, what I want more of, what I want none of, right? Yeah. If there was no other, how would I know what I like or dislike or what I'm after, right? It's only in my relationship with other people that I get to know more about myself.
Yeah.
So I have to have the other.
Yeah. This brings me back to something I thought about really early on in this conversation, but I think there's this idea of wanting to be the same man in every room I go into, right? You don't want to be a chameleon. I don't want to present myself one way and then present myself another way.
Authentic self.
There's something sort of duplicitous about that. But also it can be
two-faced.
It can be healthy, right? If I show up at a kid's party or if I show up at, a doctor's office visit, right? I'm bringing different people to the table. Right?
But you dress up for the occasion, right? If it's, if you're going to the beach, you have shorts on and a t-shirt, versus if you're going in the snow, you have boots on. So you basically are showing up for your audience, for the appropriate audience.
But it can even happen with different people in my life bring out much different sides of me, right? I just become almost a different person in the company of different people. And I've had this recognition, and maybe this is good and maybe it's not, but I think what makes me like people or not like people is really how I see myself in their company. Does that make sense? It's like around you, I feel smart. I feel funny. I feel...
I feel like you're listening to me. Taking me seriously.
So it's not even so much you that I like. So this can sound very petty and selfish. It's not you that I like so much, but it's me that I like when I'm around you.
That's so crazy. That philosopher I was talking about, Harding, like the head, like having no head is his whole thing. Like you don't have a head. All I see is you and you, right, in a room, or a dog or whatever, and I don't have a head. Right. And so where am I going to like move my body around to? Right. This thing that we call our beings. Right. I move it. I gravitate it towards like the good if I'm in that right mind frame. And I need to be with like people that I like or something. Like it's a weird concept, but like you have no head, and I can only have no head because I'm only seeing you, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I just like stumbled all over myself, but
I am also thinking about, there's a Indian like sage who I've always found very fascinating. His name is Ramana Maharshi. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's from this kind of school. It's called Advaita Vedanta. It's this non-dualist kind of sect. It's very mystical. But his story essentially was, as a very, very young man, he had this overwhelming feeling that he was dying, but he didn't die. And then he, it sounds legendary at this point, but he left home and he went to a cave, and he just sat in the cave for years, and he wouldn't even eat, and people had to come and put food in his mouth, and then just one day it was like he came back, and he was sort of awake. And then he lived out, and then there's just incredible stories about this person's life and this whole ashram he died in the 50s and it's still there, and people are just so enamored with the presence he had. I mean, people would go sit in his company and it was like he had that look, right? You see, there's a picture of his that my girlfriend and I really want to frame and put in our kitchen. It's just like, it's just incredible, his eyes are just the memory of that. His eyes, for me right now, having very little even understanding of him, makes me, makes me want to tear up. But his, basically his path was one that was very personal. He didn't have to hash out his issues with his parents. He didn't need to have long conversations. He just kind of like by himself in complete solitude.
Yeah, well, that brings me back because I'm going through Jesus, the stories with my daughter, just kind of reading the.
Jesus had his 40 days, right?
Yeah, but it's interesting because it ties into that. Like this guy is walking around basically, and finally he gets a white robe from God, right? And he doesn't really work. He just preaches the word, right, to his followers. He teaches them about God. That's it. That's all Jesus really does. I mean, yeah, like there's the miracles and stuff. He heals people. But
he was a carpenter.
Well, yeah, I guess. But when he started his ministry, he just starts roving around with these groups of people.
Yeah.
And everybody's just like in such awe of this dude.
Yeah.
And they feed him and they shelter him. I mean, you know what I mean? He doesn't like have his only needs and wants are to like preach God.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And we still talk about him today. And that's
that same
years
thing,
ago.
there's, we could watch, dozens of Netflix specials about people who did something very similar and ended up with like weird tattoos and a murder, right?
Yeah.
It's like that same.
Well, that's the perversion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess that might be the issue, is that it's it no longer is it about, it becomes personalized, right? It's no longer the therapist trying to connect you with your higher self. It's they, we start to take credit.
Yeah. Yeah. But funny that we talk about these, like you talked about, you're the Indian guy, and I'm talking about Jesus, and we talk about, you could talk about Buddha, you could talk about any of these guys, or women, right? Mother Teresa.
Buddha had the same thing, right? He sat under the Bodhi tree. At some point, he was like, I'm going to sit here until I starve or until I become enlightened, and whatever happens first, I don't care anymore. And then,
And now we're talking about this dude.
Yeah.
And that was like thousands of years ago. It's crazy. So that, yeah. Anyways, maybe that's a good place to wrap it up because I think we're running out of time.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
We should have her come on again and do an origin story, maybe. Would you be down for that?
Yeah, you know where I live, so.
Well, yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I was a little off tonight, ladies and gentlemen, but
we're used to it.
Yeah. Anyways.
We'll do a lot more of this for sure.
Yeah, we're going to do more. And we're actually going to produce a show where she's going to go over different things, like little 30-minute videos.
Or more like.
But I guess this comes
12,
back to
minutes.
why we're doing this in the first place is, just to wrap it up, is I found that to be a really worthwhile conversation. Right?
Yeah, of course. And there's so much more to be had.
Somehow I think I was able to get somewhere personally that I couldn't have otherwise done.
Well, the family model, what is it called again? I just want to...
Internal Family Systems.
Family System. That's an interesting concept.
I think you'd be fascinated if you look into it. And if you just Google it, there's so much that comes up. He'll walk you through meditations.
What was the author again? What was his name?
Richard Shorts.
Richard Short. Is he still alive or is he? Oh, he's still alive. So he's. I like that. I like studying people who are not. Jesus Christ.
Not that old.
This is cutting edge. This is going on.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. That's really cool.
Good.
So thanks
I look forward to learning more about it.
Thanks for enlightening us.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right.